In the quiet conservation lab of the San Francisco Historical Society Museum, curator Sarah Davenport leaned over a small metallic plate resting under a specialized light. The room was still, the only sounds the hum of the equipment and the faint patter of rain outside. Sarah adjusted her glasses, her sharp eyes trained on the strange image before her dot hit just 34. Sarah had already become the youngest senior curator in the museum's history. Her specialty was early photography daguerreotypes, those eerie, silvered portraits from the mid-19th century. Most people found them unsettling. The stiff poses, the hollow eyes, the strange, frozen expressions that seemed more suited to death masks than family keepsakes. But Sarah loved them. Each one, she believed, was more than just a picture. It was a fragment of time captured in metal, a portal into a world long gone. Yet the plate before her that evening didn't just feel old. It felt wrong that it had arrived only a week earlier as part of the Beckford collection, a donation from a distant descendant of one of San Francisco's wealthy gold rush families. The Beckfords had been well known in the 1850s, their fortune built on shipping and banking. But with their name faded into obscurity, all that remained were artifacts, jewelry, ledgers, letters, and photographs. Among them was this peculiar daguerreotype, DATED 1857. At first glance, it seemed simple enough. 2 children, a boy of about 10 and a girl perhaps 7. They sat rigidly in front of a dark backdrop, their solemn faces staring into the lens. The boy wore a stiff jacket, the girl a frilled dress typical of the era. Their features were pale, their eyes strangely intense, as though silently pleading. Across the centuries, Sarah's colleague, Marcus Chun, had glanced at the plate earlier and shrugged. Creepy, sure, but aren't they all? Victorian kids always look like tiny adults. They had to hold still for minutes at a time. That explains the hollow look, but Sarah wasn't convinced. Something about this one gnawed at her. The composition felt off. The darkness in the background seemed too heavy, as if it were swallowing the children whole. She leaned closer, whispering to herself, "There's something odd about this one." Later that night, when the museum grew silent and staff had gone home, Sarah scanned the daguerreotype at the highest resolution possible. Alone in her office, the rain drumming harder against the windows, she studied the magnified image. That's when she saw them. Her breath caught, behind the children, almost lost in the shadows, were hands. Large, unmistakably adult hands resting on the children's small shoulders. But the portrait had been posed for just the 2 children. There should have been no one behind them. Sarah zoomed in further until the silver surface broke into a blur of pixels. The hands remained, pale, deliberate, resting protectively or possessively on the children. She whispered to the empty office, "That's impossible." Trying to steady her nerves, Sarah dug into the donation records. The Beckford family, Jonathan and Elizabeth, with children William and Catherine, had once lived in a Nob Hill mansion long since destroyed. Jonathan had been a powerful figure until his sudden death in 1858. Not long after, Elizabeth and the children vanished from San Francisco Society. That was all the record said. No further trace. Sarah leaned back, unsettled. Outside, the storm raged harder, and for just a moment she thought she saw a handprint appear on the fogged glass of her office window. When she blinked, it was gone. Perhaps just condensation? Or her imagination. Still, she packed her things quickly and headed downstairs, her footsteps echoing in the grand Victorian stairwell. The portraits of long-dead donors glared from the walls as if watching her go. And yet, Sarah couldn't shake the sense that something else, something colder, older, was watching her too. The following day, Marcus pulled her into the archives. The basement smelled of old paper and chemicals, its air cool and heavy. Under the flickering fluorescent lights, he handed her a leather-bound ledger. "Police records," he explained. "From 1858. Look at this entry." Sarah scanned the faded ink, her heart tightening. "Investigation into the deaths of Jonathan Beckford, 45, and household staff member Harold Meyer, 27, remains inconclusive. Mrs. Elizabeth Beckford insists the deaths were accidents. Children report nothing unusual. Case suspended pending further evidence. 2 men dead, both in the same house. Both ruled accidents." Sarah frowned. "That feels a little too convenient, don't you think?" Marcus nodded grimly. "Keep reading." The next page chilled her further. Mrs. Beckford and children departed for family estate in Massachusetts. Staff reported unusual disturbances in house following deaths. Claims dismissed as superstition. Sarah whispered the word out loud. Disturbances. Marcus slid a fragile diary across the table. From one of the maids she wrote about? Strange things. Sarah carefully opened the diary, the paper brittle beneath her gloves. The words were shaky but clear. "I saw hands emerge from the walls." Children's laughter echoed through the halls, though the young ones were away. "I will not stay in that house another night." Sarah's mind flashed back to the daguerreotype. Those ghostly hands. They weren't mistakes in the silver plate. They were deliberate. Real. The 2 researchers exchanged a heavy silence. "This isn't just history," Sarah whispered. "This is something else." She thought again of the window in her office, the fleeting handprint on the glass. Perhaps imagination. Or perhaps, she realized with a sinking feeling, the past was not as far behind her as she had believed. That night, as the storm continued outside, Sarah carried the Beckford daguerreotype to her apartment. She told herself it was for safekeeping. But deep down, she knew she couldn't leave it alone in the museum. She placed it carefully on her desk, locking it in an archival box. The silver plate glimmered faintly in the dim light, as though alive. She tried to focus on research, digging through digitized records of the Beckfords. That's when she stumbled upon something stranger still. Elizabeth Beckford, the widowed matriarch, had died in Massachusetts in 1860. Cause of death: sudden illness. Her children, William and Catherine, were not mentioned again. No census records, no obituaries. It was as though they had simply disappeared. Sarah leaned back, exhausted but restless. She thought again of the maid's diary, of children's laughter in empty halls, of hands pressing through the walls of a house now long demolished. Lightning flashed across the bay, illuminating her window. And for just a moment, she swore she saw it again, finger marks dragging slowly down the glass, as though someone unseen stood outside, waiting to be let in. When the light faded, the window was bare, but the chill in the room lingered. Sarah pressed her hands together, her pulse racing. Somewhere, buried within this photograph, was a story of wealth, tragedy, and perhaps something even darker. And though she didn't know it yet, by bringing the Beckford children's portrait into the light, she had already opened a door to something far older than her museum yacht, something that had been waiting for over 160 years to be remembered. The museum basement was never welcoming. Even in daylight, the place seemed to breathe with its own rhythm of cold, damp air filled with the faint smell of paper rot and chemical preservatives. Fluorescent lights buzzed overhead, throwing harsh white shadows across rows of ancient boxes. It was here that Sarah Davenport and her colleague Marcus Chon hunched over a small desk, their gloves brushing against fragile paper that hadn't been touched in over a century. Marcus leaned in, pointing at a ledger open before them. "Read this carefully," he said, his voice low, as if raising it might disturb something that lingered in the air. The faded ink recorded a tragedy dated November 1858. Investigation into the deaths of Jonathan Beckford, age 45, and household. Staff member Harold Meyer, age 27, remains inconclusive. Mrs. Elizabeth Beckford insists the deaths were accidents resulting from falls. Children report nothing unusual. Case suspended pending further evidence. Sarah's lips tightened as she read the words. 2 deaths, both in the same house, within days of each other, and conveniently labeled accidents. That's too neat, she whispered. Too easy. Marcus nodded. Exactly what I thought. And there's more. He flipped the brittle page to reveal a follow-up entry from December of that year. Mrs. Elizabeth Beckford and children William, age 10, and Catherine, age 7, departed for family estate in Massachusetts. Mansion to be sold. Several staff report unusual disturbances in house following deaths. Claims dismissed as superstition. Sarah's pulse quickened. There it was again, the word that had already haunted her once. Disturbances? What kind of disturbances? She murmured, leaning closer. Without a word, Marcus slid another artifact across the table. A small diary, its leather cover cracked with age. This belonged to one of the maids. Read it. Sarah carefully opened the fragile volume. The handwriting was shaky, but the words were chilling. The house is no longer safe. I have seen hands emerging from the walls. I have heard laughter when the children were not at home. The master grows colder each day, his temper darker. Something unnatural clings to this house. I will not remain another night. Sarah felt her throat tighten. She looked up at Marcus, her voice barely steady. Hands, again. Marcus gave a grim smile. Matches what you saw in the photograph, doesn't it? She nodded, her mind spinning. The daguerreotype had shown ghostly hands gripping the children's shoulders. Now, over a century later, accounts from the Beckford household described the same unexplainable phenomenon. This can't just be coincidence, Sarah said. Marcus leaned back, his eyes tired but resolute. Maybe not, but we have to be careful. Old photographs can play tricks. And diaries? Well, superstition was rampant in the 1850s. People saw ghosts in every shadow. Sarah didn't answer. She wanted to agree, but deep down she couldn't. Ignore the gnawing sense that this was no superstition. That evening, Sarah returned to her office, her mind restless. She placed the daguerreotype on her desk, its silver plate catching the dim light. Alone, she studied it again. The children's faces were solemn, their eyes too direct, too knowing for one so young. And behind them, the faint shadows of those hands. She zoomed in on her digital scan, her breath catching as she noticed something she had overlooked before. Above the ghostly hands were the faintest outlines of sleeves. Sleeves that didn't belong to either child. They were adult garments, visible only in fragments, like someone standing in the frame, but somehow invisible to the camera. Sarah's skin prickled. Someone had been there. Someone who should have appeared in the portrait, but didn't. She whispered to herself, these belonged to someone standing behind them. The thought was absurd. In the 1850s, retouching a daguerreotype was crude at best, mostly limited to scratches or paint. Editing a full person out? Impossible. And yet, here the evidence was, staring back at her the following morning. The storm had passed, but Sarah carried the unease with her. She sought out Dr. Elena Vasquez, the museum's photography expert and historian of early San Francisco. Elena examined the digital scan with sharp eyes. This is Carlton's work, she said, tapping her finger against the mark etched in the corner. James W. Carlton, prominent portrait photographer in the 1850s. His studio was on Montgomery Street. He photographed many wealthy families of the time. Sarah leaned forward. Have you ever seen anything like this? She pointed to the hands. Helena frowned, shaking her head slowly. In 20 years of studying daguerreotypes, no. It's not a double exposure, not a movement artifact. These hands are deliberate. Sarah's chest tightened. If Elena couldn't explain it, that left only the unexplainable. Elena hesitated, before adding, Carlton himself died in 1859. Strange circumstances. Found in his darkroom, apparently from a seizure. But his assistant claimed he'd been working on Beckford portraits just before his death. Sarah felt a chill run through her. So whatever he saw through his lens may have followed him. Elena finished out an hour later. Sarah and Marcus were back in the archives, combing through Carlton's old business records. Most were dull appointments, financial notes, names of clients. But then, a loose page slipped free, a letter written in a shaky hand. Dated the day before Carlton's death. Sarah read it aloud. I can no longer distinguish between what is real and what I have glimpsed through my lens. The Beckford portraits have shown me things no human should see. I believe whatever was in that house has followed me. The children's eyes haunt me. Last night I felt hands on my shoulders, though I was alone. God forgive me for what I have captured. The room seemed to grow colder as Sarah's voice trailed off. She and Marcus exchanged a look equal parts fear and fascination. The daguerreotype wasn't just strange. It was cursed. That night, Sarah's dreams were fractured and restless. She woke at 3 a.m., heart racing, convinced she'd heard faint whispers in her apartment. She sat up, listening. Silence. But when she turned on her bedside lamp, her blood froze. Across the hardwood floor, leading from the bathroom to her bed, were faint wet footprints, small, child-sized. She squeezed her eyes shut, whispering, "This isn't real." When she opened them again, the prints had already faded, leaving the floor bare, but sleep never returned. The next day, Marcus brought her another discovery. I found death certificates, he said without greeting, for William and Catherine Beckford. Both died in Massachusetts, December 1858. As listed as fever. Sarah's jaw tightened. Both children? So soon after their father's death? Marcus nodded grimly. Here's the strange part. Local newspapers reported sightings of the children months after their supposed deaths. Neighbors claimed to see them playing in the gardens. Some even mentioned handprints on windows and walls. Sarah's heart pounded. The Beckford children hadn't just vanished from records. They had crossed into legend, and the more she studied their photograph, the more she feared they hadn't left this world at all. Sarah thought she understood history. She thought it was a puzzle of documents and artifacts, a discipline rooted in evidence. But as she stood before the daguerreotype once again, she realized the past doesn't always stay buried. Sometimes it reaches out through journals, through whispers, through the silvered surface of a photograph that refuses to be silent. And now, the Beckford children were reaching for her. The Beckford donation boxes had been sitting untouched in the museum's archives for weeks. Most curators dreaded these tasks, sorting through ledgers, faded correspondence, and the detritus of forgotten families. But to Sarah Davenport, the collection had become an obsession. The daguerreotype of the Beckford children had opened a door, and now she needed answers. Together with Marcus, she worked through the final crate, their gloves brushing against dusty silk, rusted jewelry, and stacks of brittle paper. For the most part, the items were unremarkable. Business letters, records of shipping contracts, receipts, all the mundane echoes of Jonathan Beckford's wealth. Then, at the very bottom, Sarah noticed a slim book bound in faded red leather. Unlike the ledgers, it was small, almost childish. In scale, she lifted it carefully, her pulse quickening as she traced the words on the inside cover. Catherine Beckford, 1858. Her breath caught. This wasn't a ledger. It was a child's journal. The first entries were innocent enough, written in the uneven scrawl of a young girl. Catherine wrote about her doll, her brother William, and the large house on Nob Hill. She described it: family dinners, the grand staircase, and the way her father's voice filled every room. But as Sarah turned the pages, the tone shifted. The handwriting grew shakier, the sentences darker. A shadow man comes to my room at night. William says I shouldn't tell, but I know he is real. He stands by the wall. His hands come through it. They try to touch us. Mother cannot see him. Sarah felt the blood drain from her face. Her hands trembled slightly as she turned to the next page. I don't like when he whispers. He says he will take us all away. William says not to be afraid, but I am afraid. He says Father cannot stop him. The walls move when he comes. The entries grew shorter, more frantic, as if written under duress. Then, abruptly, they ended. The final line, dated November 1858, the very month Jonathan Beckford died, was a chilling fragment. He says he will take us soon. I saw his hands again tonight. And then, nothing. Sarah closed the journal, her heart pounding. Even for someone trained to separate fact from superstition, the words were too precise, too haunting to ignore. Marcus leaned over her shoulder, his brow furrowed. It matches everything. The maid's diary, the photograph, even Carlton's letter. Sarah whispered. These weren't just ghost stories. Catherine experienced it. She wrote it down. For a long moment, they sat in silence, the weight of the little red book pressing down on them both. Outside, the storm had intensified. Again, the rain lashing the museum's basement windows. The air felt damp and heavy. As Sarah placed the journal back on the desk, she froze. Something moved across the glass dot. At first she thought it was water streaking down the pane, but then she saw it 5 distinct marks, dragging slowly downward. Finger marks. Marcus saw it too. His face went pale. They both rushed to the window, but by the time they reached it, there was nothing there. Just rain and the dark, wet streets of Pacific Heights beyond. Neither spoke, but both knew what they had seen. That night, Sarah lay awake in her apartment, staring at the ceiling. She tried to rationalize the events of the past week. Ghostly. Hands in a photograph. Fingerprints on glass. A child's diary filled with whispers of something lurking in the walls. It was easy to dismiss one incident as coincidence. 2, maybe. But now the evidence was stacking up like bricks in a wall she couldn't ignore. Her phone buzzed, startling her. It was a message from Marcus. Found something. Meet me tomorrow morning. Urgent. She set the phone down, unease curling in her stomach. Even through the quiet of her apartment, she thought she heard the faint sound of children's laughter drifting through the night. By dawn, Sarah was back at the museum. Marcus was already waiting, hunched over his laptop in the archives. I dug deeper into the Beckfords' Massachusetts years, he said without preamble. You won't like what I found. On the screen were digitized newspaper clippings from late 1858. Small notices, barely more than whispers in the press. Tragedy strikes Beckford family. Children William and Catherine Beckford dead of sudden fever. Buried in family plot. Service closed to public. But alongside the official record were odd reports from neighbors. Local children claimed to have seen William and Catherine Beckford playing in the gardens weeks after their reported deaths. Unexplained handprints found on windows and walls. Of Beckford estate, staff unsettled. Family declines comment. Sarah leaned closer. They were reported dead, but people kept seeing them alive? Marcus nodded grimly, and the handprints followed them. Just like here. Sarah felt her stomach twist. Every new piece of evidence added another layer to the puzzle, but instead of clarity, it only deepened the mystery. The Beckford children hadn't just lived and died. They had left traces, impossible traces, that refused to vanish even after death. Later that afternoon, Sarah returned to her office with the daguerreotype. She stared at it under the lamplight, her mind racing. She remembered Catherine's final journal entry. He says he will take us soon. Who was he? The shadow man? Their father? Or something else altogether? And the hands, always the hands. Reaching from walls, appearing in glass, pressing into photographs. Sarah locked the photograph away, but even behind glass and steel, it seemed to hum with energy. She could almost feel the weight of unseen eyes, watching from the shadows of her office. For the first time in her career, Sarah Davenport wondered if history was not just about the past, but about forces that refused to stay buried. The next morning, she sought out Elena Vasquez again. Elena, what happens when a photograph doesn't just capture light? What if it captures something else? Elena gave her a long, searching look. You're asking if a camera can capture what the human eye cannot? Yes, Sarah said. Elena hesitated before answering. Photographs are more than images. They're imprints of a moment in time. If something was there, something unseen, it is not impossible for the lens to catch it. Sarah swallowed hard. Carlton's letter said he saw things no human should. He believed the camera revealed what followed him. Elena sighed. Be careful, Sarah. Sometimes looking too closely opens doors we cannot close. That night, Sarah couldn't resist one final act. She placed Catherine's journal on her desk beside the daguerreotype. Together, side by side, they felt like two halves of a story, desperately trying to tell itself. As she turned off her lamp, she glanced back one last time. For a fleeting second, she thought she saw the faint outline of a child's hand pressed against the glass of the photograph, as though reaching toward the little red journal. And then the office was swallowed by darkness. Sarah had uncovered records, diaries, and fragments of truth. But she sensed the Beckford story was far from over. If anything, the real nightmare was just beginning. The storm over San Francisco had passed, leaving behind streets washed clean and skies heavy with fog. Yet inside the museum, the air felt anything but fresh. Sarah Davenport's mind remained tangled in fragments of history. Catherine Beckford's disturbing journal, the daguerreotype with its ghostly hands, and now the unsettling reports from Massachusetts. By mid-morning, Sarah sat at the desk of Dr. Elena Vasquez, the museum's photography historian. The digital scan of the daguerreotype glowed on the computer screen between them. Elena studied it in silence, her expression troubled. I've seen thousands of these plates, Elena finally said, her voice low. But never anything like this. The hands are too precise, too intentional. It isn't a flaw. It isn't an accident. Sarah leaned forward. Then what is it? Could someone have been standing behind them? Elena shook her head. If someone had been there, the camera would have captured their entire form, not just their hands. This suggests something partially visible, something caught between worlds. The word sent a chill down Sarah's spine. Elena clicked. To enlarge the maker's mark, etched in the corner of the image. See this? J.W. Carlton. He was one of the most prominent photographers in San Francisco during the 1850s. Wealthy families sought him out. His portraits were known for clarity and artistry. Sarah frowned. Do we know much about him? Enough, Elena replied. Carlton died in 1859. His death was unusual. He was found in his darkroom, collapsed beside a plate he'd been working on. His assistant claimed Carlton had been acting strangely in the weeks before, sleepless, paranoid. He kept insisting that the Beckford photographs were showing him things. Sarah felt her skin prickle. Showing him things? Yes, his assistant said Carlton believed the camera was revealing what the human eye could not. He spoke of shadows moving, of children's eyes following him. He even mentioned hands on his shoulders when no one was there. The silence that followed seemed heavy with implication. Sarah whispered, "He died right after working on the Beckford portraits." Elena nodded. "Exactly. Whatever haunted that family, it touched Carlton too." By noon, Sarah and Marcus were back in the archives, digging through a newly cataloged set of Carlton's business records. The ledgers confirmed multiple sessions with the Beckfords between 1857 and 1858, but then a loose sheet slipped free. Its ink faded, but legible dot. It was a letter written in Carlton's hand, dated the day before his death. I can no longer distinguish what is real from what my lens reveals. The Beckford portraits show me things I should not see. I feel them near me. Even now, the children's eyes follow me. Last night, unseen hands pressed upon my shoulders. God forgive me for what I have captured. Sarah read it twice, her pulse quickening with every line. "He was terrified," she whispered. Marcus's face was pale in the fluorescent light. He believed the photograph was cursed. Sarah looked down at the fragile paper, and for the first time, she believed it too. That evening, Sarah carried the daguerreotype home again. The thought of leaving it in the museum unsettled her. She set it carefully on her desk, the silver surface faintly gleaming dot as the night deepened. She forced herself to keep working, cross-referencing records, rereading Catherine's journal. But at 3 a.m, she jolted awake at her desk. The lamp was still on. Her laptop screen glowed with the digital scan of the daguerreotype. Her eyes widened. The image had changed. The children were still there, but their expressions were altered. Their faces looked more hollow, their eyes darker, and the ghostly hands seemed sharper, more defined, as though pressing harder into their small shoulders. Her breath caught. Then, slowly, letters began appearing across the screen, not typed, not emailed, but as though someone or something was writing directly into the document in real time. "Find me." Sarah's chair clattered backward as she stumbled to her feet. She pulled the plug from the computer, but the screen stayed lit for another long second before going black. Her apartment was silent, but the silence felt wrong, like a held breath waiting to be released. She whispered to the empty room, "What do you want from me?" No answer came, only the faint creak of floorboards in the hallway. The next day, she told Marcus what had happened. He wanted to dismiss it, but she could see fear behind his eyes. Instead of arguing, he pushed a stack of printouts across the table. "Death certificates," he said. "William and Catherine Beckford. Both died within weeks of leaving San Francisco. Official cause: fever." Sarah scanned the records, shaking her head. That doesn't explain the reports of neighbors seeing them alive, or the handprints. Marcus leaned closer. Maybe the fever was just a cover. Maybe something else killed them. Sarah thought of Catherine's final diary entry. "He says he will take us soon." A shadow man, hands reaching from the walls. A photograph that refused to stay still. She whispered, "Maybe something followed them." That afternoon, they combed through more of Carlton's notes. His handwriting grew progressively more frantic, describing strange sensations, whispers in the darkroom, shadows flickering at the edge of vision, and a child's laugh that echoed when no one was there. One note in particular caught Sarah's. The Beckford boy speaks to me in dreams. He begs me not to look. He says their sister is gone, hidden where no one will find her. Yet I see her in every plate I take. A third child. She wants to be seen." Sarah's breath caught. "A third child," Marcus frowned. "But the records only mention William and Catherine." Sarah whispered, "Unless there was another. One erased from history." The thought settled between them like a weight too heavy to move. That night, Sarah's apartment felt colder than ever. She placed the daguerreotype back into its box, but, even sealed away, it seemed alive, Humming with some invisible energy. At 3 a.m., she awoke again. This time, it wasn't the glow of her computer that startled her. It was the sound of small footsteps padding across the floor. She sat up, heart racing, her eyes darting to the shadows. And there, just for an instant, she saw it, a small handprint, pressed against the mirror across the room. Then another beside it, then another, until a cluster of tiny prints covered the glass. Sarah's breath came fast and shallow. She whispered, "What do you want?" For a moment, silence. Then the faintest sound like a child's voice carried on the air. "Find her." And then, as quickly as they appeared, the handprints faded, leaving only her pale reflection staring back. By morning, Sarah knew one thing with absolute certainty. This wasn't just about two children in a photograph. There had been a third, and she was still waiting to be found. The archives had always been a place of silence, but that morning the stillness felt different, watchful, almost suffocating. Sarah Davenport and Marcus Chon spread a new set of documents across the table, their gloves brushing against fragile paper as if disturbing secrets best left untouched. The words in Carlton's frantic notes echoed in Sarah's mind. A third child. She wants to be seen. It didn't make sense. The Beckford records were clear. Jonathan and Elizabeth had two children, William and Catherine. Yet the evidence kept pointing elsewhere. Catherine's journal spoke of a shadow man. Carlton's notes hinted at a hidden sibling. And the daguerreotype itself seemed to whisper for attention, its image shifting, its hands reaching. Could a third child really have existed? Marcus asked, his voice low. Sarah nodded slowly. If she died young, it's possible the family erased her. Families often buried infant deaths quietly. But Carlton's notes make it sound deliberate, as if she was hidden. Marcus tapped a stack of donation papers. There might be something in the Beckford boxes we overlooked. Families kept private records, diaries, letters. We need to check. Again, hours later, surrounded by piles of papers, Sarah pulled out something small, almost overlooked. A bundle of letters bound with a faded ribbon, the ink nearly lost to time. They were addressed to Elizabeth Beckford from her sister in Massachusetts. One line made Sarah's breath hitch. "How is little Mary? You did not mention her in your last letter." Sarah whispered the name aloud. Mary. Marcus leaned closer. That's it, the third child. Sarah scanned the rest of the correspondence. In later letters, Elizabeth never responded to the question. Mary was never mentioned again. It was as though she had been erased. Sarah sat back, her pulse racing. She existed, and then she disappeared. That evening, Sarah placed the daguerreotype and Catherine's red journal side by side on her desk. The silver plate reflected the lamplight, and for a brief moment she thought she saw it, a faint outline, a third figure in the shadows beside William and Catherine. A smaller child, almost too faint to notice. She blinked, and the outline was gone. But the impression lingered. Mary had been there all along, buried not just in walls or records, but in history itself. The next day, Sarah and Marcus arranged a meeting with the museum's consultant, Rosalind Watts. Officially, she specialized in cultural artifacts connected to spiritual practices. Unofficially, she had a reputation as a medium, someone who could sense the imprints objects carried with them. When Sarah laid the daguerreotype on the table, Rosalind didn't touch it. She leaned close, her eyes narrowing. There were 3 children, she said simply. Sarah's chest tightened. The records only mentioned 2. Rosalind shook her head. Nevertheless, there were 3. The third stands here. She pointed to a faint empty space beside Catherine in the photograph. Her name was Mary. Marcus frowned. How could? You know that? Rosalind's voice was calm, steady. Because she is still here. Her presence clings to this photograph. She was erased in life, but not in spirit. Sarah's stomach churned. Why the hands? Why do they keep appearing? Rosalind's gaze darkened, because Mary wasn't alone. Those hands belonged to someone else. Harold Meyer, the family servant. He tried to protect the children. Marcus stiffened. Protect them from what? Rosalind's reply was blunt. From their father. The words hung heavy in the room. Jonathan Beckford, wealthy businessman, pillar of San Francisco society, was no victim of accident, no tragic figure. He was something far worse. Rosalind leaned back, her eyes still on the daguerreotype. Jonathan Beckford killed his youngest daughter in a rage. Harold helped the surviving children hide her body in the house's walls, hoping to protect them. But the secret consumed him. He died shortly after, whether by his own hand or by whatever haunted that house, no one can say. Sarah felt ill. And the children? William and Catherine? They carried Mary with them, Rosalind said. Her spirit followed. Their deaths in Massachusetts were no simple fever. They were pulled down by the weight of what happened, by the sister who was never laid to rest. Silence filled the room. For the first time, Sarah realized the photograph wasn't just a relic of history. It was a cry for justice. That night, Sarah dreamed vividly. She was back in the Beckford mansion, as it must have stood in 1857. The halls were grand, the chandeliers glowing, the rooms alive with wealth. But the air was suffocating. She followed the sound of laughter down a corridor. At the end stood 3 children. William, tall and serious. Catherine, clutching a doll. And beside them, smaller, younger Mary. Mary's eyes met Sarah's. She raised her small hand, pointing toward the wall. Here, she whispered. Then the walls began to ripple, hands pushing through from the other side. Sarah woke with a cry, drenched in sweat. By morning, she knew what had to be done. We have to go to the Beckford mansion site, she told Marcus. If Mary was hidden in the walls, her remains may still be there. Marcus hesitated. That house was destroyed in the 1906 earthquake. The site is apartments now. There's nothing left. Sarah shook her head. Not nothing. The foundation. If she was buried there, the foundation might still hold her. Marcus sighed, but there was no denying the determination in Sarah's eyes. Then we'll start there. That afternoon, they drove through the fog-laden streets of San Francisco, arriving at an upscale apartment building on Nob Hill. To passers-by, it looked ordinary glass doors, manicured entryway, a polite doorman named Walter. But to Sarah, the weight of history pressed heavy. This was the ground where the Beckford mansion once stood. This was where Mary had vanished. When Sarah explained they were researching the site, Walter nodded knowingly. The Beckford place still has its cornerstone in the basement. Management talks about making a display, but people don't like going down there. Too many stories. What kind of stories? Marcus asked. Walter hesitated. Children running in the halls. Handprints on the walls. Maintenance crews refused to work down there alone. Sarah's heart pounded. Mary was here. She had never left. Walter led them into the basement, where the modern storage units gave way to old stonework. In the far corner, a massive block bore the inscription, Beckford, 1852. Sarah stepped closer, her breath shallow. She traced the rough carvings along the edge, childlike drawings etched into the stone. Stick figures, a house, and elongated hands. Reaching out toward the figures, her voice trembled. These aren't modern graffiti. They're old. Too old. Marcus bent close, his face pale. The children drew these. And for a moment, in the dim light, Sarah thought she heard it again. Faint laughter, echoing from nowhere. Mary Beckford was still waiting to be found. The basement of the Nob Hill apartment building was nothing like the elegant museum archive Sarah was used to. The air was heavy, damp with the smell of stone and rust. A single light bulb flickered above the exposed foundation wall, throwing jagged shadows across the cold concrete floor. Walter, the doorman, shifted uneasily as he guided Sarah and Marcus toward the far corner. "This is what's left of the original Beckford mansion," he explained. His voice carried a tremor, betraying nerves he tried to hide. "They kept part of the foundation when the new building went up. Some people say it should have been torn out completely." "Why?" Sarah asked. Walter gave her a long look. "Because of the stories." Marcus raised a brow. "What kind of stories?" Walter hesitated, glancing at the stone as though afraid to speak near it. "Running footsteps at night. Children's laughter when there are no children here. Handprints on the walls that won't wash away. Maintenance crews won't come down here alone. Some even quit over it." Sarah's chest tightened. She reached out and brushed her gloved fingers over the massive cornerstone, still etched with the word, Beckford, 1852. The stone was colder than it should have been. Marcus knelt, inspecting the foundation. "Sarah, look at this." Carved faintly along the edge of the block were small etchings. Childlike drawings, stick figures, a house, and long hands stretching toward the figures. "Kids must have scratched these in later years," Walter muttered, though his voice lacked conviction. "No," Sarah whispered. "The stone is too hard. This would have taken time. These markings are old, very old." She ran her fingers across the stick figures, imagining small, desperate hands pressing against the stone in the flickering candlelight of the 1850s. This was where the Beckford children had lived. This was where Mary had vanished. Back at the museum, Sarah and Marcus pored over the notes left by Eliza Montgomery, a writer who had once researched the Beckford family a decade earlier before abruptly abandoning her work. Her journals were filled with unsettling entries. Jonathan Beckford's fortune was built on cruelty. He foreclosed on families in winter, leaving mothers and children to freeze. One account describes a woman and 2 children who died after being cast into the streets in 1857. Many claimed the Beckford house carried the weight of these injustices. During my visits to the site, I experienced phenomena myself. Handprints on my apartment walls. Whispers in the night. I believe the Beckford children have attached themselves to anyone who tries to uncover their story. Her research ended abruptly after a breakdown. Notes from her assistant claimed Eliza believed the Beckford children were following her home. Sarah shivered as she closed the journal. The parallels were undeniable. The handprints. The whispers. She was experiencing them too. That evening she returned once more to the basement of the Nob Hill building. Marcus walked beside her, though neither spoke. The air felt oppressive, as though the walls themselves were holding their breath. They stood again before the cornerstone. Sarah placed her hand flat against the cold surface. At first, nothing. Then she froze. The stone vibrated faintly beneath her palm, almost imperceptible, as though something on the other side was moving. "Did you feel that?" she whispered. Marcus touched the stone. His eyes widened. "It's cold. Too cold." A faint sound followed. Scratching, like fingernails dragging slowly against stone. Both of them stumbled back, eyes fixed on the wall. The scratching grew louder, echoing through the basement until it was impossible to deny. Walter muttered a prayer under. The scratching against the wall haunted Sarah long after she left the Nob Hill basement. Even back in the quiet of her apartment, she swore she could still hear it, the faint scrape of nails dragging across stone. Desperate, endless, unrelenting. She knew what it meant. Someone was still there. The following morning, Sarah and Marcus sat in the office of the property manager, a nervous man in his 60s with thick glasses and an impatient manner. "We're not in the business of ghost hunts," he said firmly. "If you want to study historical documents, fine. But tearing into the foundation of a functioning apartment building? Absolutely not. Sarah leaned forward, her voice steady. This isn't superstition. We've uncovered records, journals, and even a confession suggesting there may be human remains inside that wall. If that's true, this is more than history. This is a matter for the authorities, the manager scoffed. The building is stable. Disturbing the foundation could compromise its integrity. Marcus slid a folder across the desk. Inside were Carlton's frantic letters, the maid's diary, Catherine's journal, and Montgomery's abandoned research. Each one told the same story in a different hand. Hands in the walls, whispers in the night, a missing child. The manager skimmed a few pages, his face paling slightly. This is circumstantial at best. Sarah's eyes narrowed. Then, let us prove it. One scan, non-invasive. If we find nothing, we walk away. The manager hesitated, then sighed. One scan. That's it. If you find something, we'll discuss permits. 2 days later, the basement hummed with new energy. A graduate student named Amir, specializing in archaeological surveys, set up his ground-penetrating radar. The sleek device looked out of place among the rough stone walls and flickering bulbs. Sarah stood nearby, her heart pounding as Amir pressed the scanner against the old foundation. The machine beeped rhythmically as it mapped the density of the stone. Minutes dragged. The readings showed nothing unusual until Amir froze. Hold on, he murmured, squinting at the screen. There's something here. A void. Sarah rushed. Closer. How big? About 2 feet by 3. Right behind this section. He tapped the cold stone. This isn't part of the original construction. The pattern changes here. It looks like something was sealed inside. Sarah's breath caught. A hidden cavity. The manager shifted nervously. That doesn't mean anything. Could be an Hun. Old repair, an air pocket. But his words died in his throat when a faint stain began seeping through the stone. 3 parallel lines, dark and rusty, dragging downward like fingers. Marcus's voice was tight. Tell me you see that. Everyone nodded silently. The manager stumbled back. What? What is that? Blood? Marcus forced a shaky laugh. Rust. It's just rust from old pipes. But Sarah stepped forward, placing her hand against the wall. The stone was ice cold. And deep inside, she thought she heard it again, the faint scrape of nails. Her voice was firm. We need to open this wall. That night, after hours of heated phone calls and desperate pleas, the manager relented. An emergency permit was secured. By evening, a structural engineer arrived with chisels and crowbars, his face skeptical but curious. The basement grew crowded. Sarah, Marcus, Amir, the manager, and a small police presence, called in just in case. The engineer worked slowly, carefully prying loose one stone at a time. Each removal released a faint, musty smell, the breath of something sealed away for over a century. Finally, after nearly an hour, the cavity yawned open. A flashlight beam cut through the darkness inside. Everyone fell silent. Within the narrow void lay the unmistakable outline of a small skeleton. Fragile bones curled inward, wrapped in the decayed fabric of what had once been a child's dress. Around the tiny neck hung a tarnished locket, still clasped in place. The room froze in stunned silence. My God, Marcus whispered. The property. Manager staggered back, his face ashen. There's really a body in there. Sarah's chest tightened. Her voice broke into a whisper. Mary. The forensics team moved in quickly, documenting the remains. Though over 160 years had passed, the evidence was undeniable. The child had been hidden deliberately, entombed. Within the walls of her own home. As the police carried the small bones away, Sarah stood apart, her hands trembling. All the journals, all the whispers, All the handprints they had been leading here. For the first time, Mary Beckford was no longer lost. That night, Sarah returned home drained, yet her apartment felt different. The air seemed lighter, the silence less oppressive. No handprints appeared on her mirror, no whispers in the dark. She almost allowed herself to believe it was over until her phone chimed out. It was a message from Marcus. Check the photograph, now. Heart racing, Sarah pulled the daguerreotype from its archival box and held it under the LAMPLIGHT that her breath caught, the hands that had once gripped. William and Catherine's shoulders were gone in their place. Standing between them was a third child, a small girl in a white dress. Her expression solemn, but her presence undeniable. Mary Beckford had returned. Sarah sat frozen, staring at the plate. It had physically changed. The silver surface had rearranged itself, rewriting history. Before her eyes, she whispered to the empty room, "You're real now. You're part of the story again." For a long moment, the apartment was silent. Then, just as sleep began to overtake her, she thought she heard a faint child's voice near her ear. "Thank you." The sound was soft, fleeting, and gone in an instant. But Sarah smiled through her tears. For the first time, she felt peace. Mary Beckford had been found. The discovery of Mary Beckford's remains shook San Francisco's Historical Society to its core. News spread quickly. Archaeologists, police, and journalists all wanted details. But for Sarah Davenport, the historian at the center of it all, one object stood out among the crumbling bones and fragments of a child's dress. It was the locket. Small, silver, and tarnished black with age, it had survived more than a century sealed inside the wall. The chain was fragile, the clasp fused shut with corrosion, but Sarah knew immediately it carried meaning. Objects buried with the dead always did. Back at the museum, the locket was carefully transferred to the conservation lab. Dr. Elena Vasquez, the photography expert, joined Sarah as they examined it under soft light. "This will be delicate," Elena warned. "The metal is weak. If there's anything inside hair, a photo, paper, it could crumble to dust the moment air hits it." Sarah nodded, her stomach tight. The weight of history pressed down on them both. This wasn't just an artifact. It was a voice, sealed away, waiting to speak. For hours, Elena worked with microtools, dissolving corrosion millimeter by millimeter. Sarah watched with barely contained impatience, her heart pounding with every scrape. Finally, with a faint metallic snap, the locket opened. Inside were two things. On one side, a faded photograph barely visible, but discernible as a family portrait. On the other, folded tightly, was a scrap of paper. Elena inhaled sharply. This survived? Sarah leaned close as Elena carefully unfolded the brittle sheet with tweezers. The ink was faint but legible, the handwriting shaky. Rushed. Sarah, read aloud. "May God forgive what I could not prevent. Mary Elizabeth Beckford, beloved daughter, born May 3, 1852, taken by her father's hand. October 17, 1857. Her siblings know the truth. I have helped conceal her body at their request, to protect them from suffering the same fate. The master's fall was no accident. May the children find peace that eluded them in this house of horrors. Harold Meyer." The room fell silent. Sarah's throat tightened. Harold Meyer, the loyal servant who had died the same day as Jonathan Beckford, had left a confession. Not only had Jonathan murdered his youngest daughter, but his death had not been an accident either. Marcus, who had joined them midway, whispered, "The children killed him." Elena's face was pale, and Harold helped them cover it up. Sarah felt her chest tighten as the truth settled into place. The Beckford story wasn't simply one of tragedy. It was one of abuse, murder, and desperate survival. The locket and confession changed everything. Historians had long viewed Jonathan Beckford as a ruthless but respectable businessman of the gold rush era. Now, evidence revealed him as something darker, a murderer within his own household. For the first time in over a century, the children's voices were being heard. Sarah whispered to herself, "Mary isn't forgotten anymore." That night, Sarah worked late in her office, processing the implications. She locked the daguerreotype in its archival box, but even from across the room, she could feel its presence. At one point, all of her computer monitors flickered to life, each one displaying the same altered image, the three Beckford children standing together. But their eyes were scratched out, dark voids staring into her. She rushed to the archival box, yanking it open. The physical daguerreotype was unchanged. The hands were gone, Mary was present, and their faces were solemn but intact. It was only the digital copies that bore the mutilations. The message was clear. The story wasn't finished. The next morning, Sarah sought out Rosalind Watts, the medium who had identified Mary's presence before they found her body. Rosalind studied the locket and read Harold's confession quietly, her face grave. "Wanted the truth known," Rosalind said softly. "The children carried this secret for too long." They bound it into the locket, buried with Mary, hoping someday someone would find it. Sarah hesitated. But if Mary has been found, why are the disturbances still happening? Rosalind's eyes darkened. Because the story isn't complete. Harold wrote the confession, but Mary's death was never acknowledged publicly. Her father's crimes were buried along with her. Until the truth is recognized, the children will not rest. Sarah thought of the altered digital scans, the scratched-out eyes. It was as if the children themselves were demanding more. "Then we give them what they want," Sarah said firmly. "We make sure the world knows what really happened in that house." Later that week, the museum director held an emergency meeting. The locket, confession, and remains had created a storm of academic and media interest. Plans for an exhibition began immediately. The Beckford family, secrets of a gold rush dynasty. The director smiled at Sarah. "This is the historical discovery of your career. The daguerreotype will be the centerpiece." Sarah hesitated. "I'm not sure that's wise." "Why not?" the director asked. She glanced at Marcus, who gave her a knowing look. Neither could say out loud what they had experienced. The handprints, the whispers, the altered images. Sarah finally said, "Because these children weren't curiosities. They were victims. We can't exploit them." The director frowned. "History is history. People want to see it." Sarah remained silent. She knew the fight ahead would not just be about presenting facts. It would be about respecting the dead. That night, exhausted, she returned home. For the first time in weeks, her apartment was quiet. No whispers, no handprints. She almost dared to believe peace had settled. But as she prepared for bed, she noticed something new. On her desk lay a piece of paper that hadn't been there before. A childish drawing in uneven lines. 3 stick figures holding hands beneath a smiling sun. Beneath it, written in shaky letters, were 2 words: "Thank you." Sarah held the drawing with trembling hands. A wave of warmth washed over her. The Beckford children had been silenced for over 160 years. But now, at last, they were remembered. Yet even as she placed the drawing carefully into her bag, she couldn't shake Rosalind's warning. The story wasn't over, and until the world heard the full truth, every detail, every horror, the Beckford children would never fully rest. The museum buzzed with an excitement Sarah found impossible to share. Preparations for the Beckford family, secrets of a gold rush dynasty, had begun, and the daguerreotype was already being mounted in its display case. Staff worked feverishly, setting up lights, arranging Harold Meyer's confession under glass, and polishing the small locket that had survived a century sealed in stone. To the director, it was history. To Sarah, it was a graveyard dot. She stood in the center of the gallery, arms folded, watching the pieces of the puzzle she had uncovered turned into spectacle. Tourists would gawk, cameras would flash, and the Beckford children, the same children who had whispered in the dark and left, handprints on her walls, would once again be silenced. Marcus joined her, his expression uneasy. "Does this feel wrong to you?" Sarah didn't answer immediately. Her eyes lingered on the daguerreotype, resting in its protective frame. For weeks, the silver plate had changed before her eyes, first showing ghostly hands, then revealing Mary's form in full. Now, under the sterile museum lighting, it looked fixed. 3 children, solemn and still, staring out from 1857. But Sarah knew better. Photographs were not prisons. They were windows. And sometimes, what waited on the other side wanted to be seen. The first sign of trouble came during installation. A technician swore he heard footsteps pacing behind him when he worked alone at night. Another claimed the lights in the gallery flickered in a pattern, like Morse code long, short, long whenever he touched the daguerreotype case dot by the third. Night, security cameras recorded faint childlike figures darting across the gallery floor after closing. The museum director dismissed them as glitches, insisting the footage be locked away. But Sarah saw the recordings with her own eyes. There were 3 of them. 2 days before opening, the disturbances grew impossible to ignore. The conservation team discovered new markings etched into Harold's confession glass. At first, they thought it was a scratch, but under closer light, letters formed words written from the inside. "Tell them." Sarah's heart pounded as she traced the letters with her fingertip. They don't just want recognition. They want the whole truth exposed. Marcus nodded grimly. And they won't stop until it is. That night, Sarah stayed late, determined to confront the heart of it. She walked the silent halls of the museum, the echo of her footsteps swallowed by the dim glow of emergency lights. The Beckford exhibition stood finished, ready for the public. She approached the daguerreotype, her reflection wavering in the glass. "Mary," she whispered, voice trembling, "I found you. I told your story. What more do you want from me?" For a long moment, there was only silence. Then, slowly, the silver image on the plate began to shift. The 3 children blurred, their faces stretching, eyes hollowing into pits of darkness. Behind them, faint at first but growing clearer, the towering figure of a man emerged. Jonathan Beckford. His expression was twisted, cruel, one hand gripping Mary's shoulder so tightly the metal seemed to buckle under the image. His mouth opened, wide, frozen in a silent roar. Sarah stumbled back, her heart hammering. The children hadn't only wanted their existence remembered. They wanted their father exposed. The next morning, Sarah confronted the director. "You can't just present this as another Gold Rush family story. Jonathan Beckford was a murderer. The exhibit has to tell the truth, all of it." The director waved her off. "We can't make accusations against a man who's been dead for over a century. We're a museum, not a courtroom." Marcus slammed his hand on the table. "We found a body in the walls. We have a signed confession. How much more proof do you need?" The director's voice sharpened. "Enough. The exhibit goes forward as planned. Historical context, not sensationalism. That's final." Sarah's voice trembled with anger. "If you silence them again, you'll regret it." But the director didn't listen. That night, the museum itself seemed to rebel. Security alarms triggered without cause. Motion sensors picked up movement in empty galleries. Guards reported hearing children's laughter echoing through the halls, followed by sharp cries of terror. By dawn, one guard had resigned, refusing to return. Sarah received a frantic call from Marcus. The daguerreotype, it changed again. "You need to see this." She rushed to the museum. In the gallery, under the harsh morning light, The image had warped. The children stood as they always had, but now Jonathan loomed behind them, unmistakable, his hands resting on their shoulders. Across the bottom of the silver plate, new words had etched themselves in faint, ghostly script. Show them what he did. Sarah's stomach twisted. The message was clear. If the museum refused to reveal the truth, the children would reveal it themselves, through fear, through terror, through the corruption of history itself. As opening day approached, the tension grew unbearable. Sarah barely slept. Each night, her apartment filled with faint sounds, footsteps, scratching, whispers. One evening, her mirror fogged with condensation, though the room was cold and dry. 3 small handprints appeared across the glass, lingering for hours before fading. The children were following her again. Marcus tried to reassure her. They chose you. They trust you. You're the one who can finally give them justice. But Sarah wasn't sure justice was possible. Not when the museum insisted on sanitizing the past, turning human tragedy into spectacle. She knew one thing. If she didn't act, the Beckford children would never rest. On the eve of the exhibition's grand opening, Sarah stood once more in the gallery, staring at the daguerreotype under its polished glass case. Around her, the museum was silent. Slowly, she leaned close to the image. "I'll do it," she whispered. "I'll make them hear your story. All of it." For a moment, the children's faces softened. Their hollow eyes filled in, returning to solemn, human expressions. Mary tilted her head ever so slightly, as though acknowledging her promise. But behind them, Jonathan still lingered, his shadow tall, his mouth twisted in rage. The battle wasn't over. And as Sarah turned to leave the gallery, the lights flickered violently, plunging the room into darkness. A deep, guttural whisper echoed from the glass. "Liar." Sarah froze. Her skin went cold. It wasn't just the children who had been listening. Jonathan Beckford's spirit was awake. The night of the exhibition arrived, draped in uneasy anticipation. Outside the museum, a line stretched down the block. Reporters clustered near the doors, their cameras flashing as dignitaries and history enthusiasts filed in. For most, the Beckford family, secrets of a gold rush dynasty, promised a rare glimpse into San Francisco's shadowy past. For Sarah Davenport, it felt like walking into a storm. Inside, the gallery shimmered with polished glass cases and perfectly arranged displays. The Beckford daguerreotype hung at the center like a crown jewel, its silver surface gleaming under spotlights. Beside it, Harold Meyer's confession lay under glass, alongside the tarnished locket pried from Mary's remains. The director stood proudly at the entrance, greeting guests with a practiced smile. "Tonight, we unveil the truth of a family, long hidden in the annals of history," he declared. The Beckfords remind us that even the wealthiest families carried secrets that shaped the city we live in today. Sarah's stomach churned. Secrets, he called them. But what about murders? What about children silenced, their cries buried in stone? The truth had already twisted the photograph, whispered in the halls, and etched itself into glass. If the director refused to acknowledge it, the spirits themselves would do it for him, and they would not be gentle. The crowd gathered around the daguerreotype, admiring it as though it were a simple relic. Many whispered about the ghostly reputation surrounding it, but most laughed it off. "Spooky, isn't it?" one woman said. "Perfect for October." Sarah clenched her fists. They didn't understand. This wasn't a Halloween attraction. It was a wound that still bled. Marcus leaned close to her. "Watch their faces," he whispered. "If anything happens tonight, it'll be here." Sarah nodded, though her heart raced. She couldn't shake the sense that Jonathan Beckford was waiting, coiled within the image like a snake ready to strike. At exactly 7 o'clock, the director dimmed the lights for the keynote presentation. A projector lit up the wall, displaying a timeline of the Beckford family's history. The audience leaned forward as he spoke about Jonathan's business empire, Catherine's quiet presence, and the children whose lives seemed to vanish after. 1857. And here, the director announced proudly, is the Beckford family daguerreotype, one of the earliest surviving photographic portraits from San Francisco's gold rush era. All eyes turned to the glass case. For a moment, nothing happened. The silver plate reflected the gallery's glow, the three children staring back in frozen solemnity. Guests whispered, admiring the detail dot. Then the lights flickered dot at first. It was subtle, a brief dimming easily explained away. But within seconds, the bulbs above the daguerreotype surged and died, plunging the gallery into a dim orange haze. Gasps rippled through the crowd. Sarah's breath caught. She knew this pattern. The photograph began to change. Before the stunned eyes of 100 guests, the children in the daguerreotype shifted. Their faces blurred, their solemn expressions twisting into agony. Mary's mouth opened in a silent scream. William and Catherine's eyes widened with terror, as though they were reliving the moment their father's hand closed around their sister's throat. Then Jonathan appeared. His towering figure emerged behind them, sharper and clearer than ever. His hand clamped onto Mary's shoulder, his face contorted with cruelty. The silver plate pulsed with an unnatural glow, as though lit from within. Guests shrieked. Some stumbled backward. Others pressed closer. Transfixed by horror dot, the director rushed forward, shouting, "It's a trick of the light, a projection error." But his voice faltered as fresh words etched themselves across the bottom of the plate in jagged silver script. "He killed U.S." The room erupted in chaos. Children cried as their parents pulled them away. Guests stampeded toward the exit, their fear amplified by the crackling of bulbs overhead. The smell of burning metal filled the air as the lights shorted out, showering. Sparks across the floor dot through it all. Sarah stood frozen, her eyes locked on the image. The Beckford children stared directly at her now, their hollow eyes pleading. Mary's tiny hand pressed flat against the inside of the glass, as though reaching through time itself. Sarah whispered, barely audible above the panic, "I'll tell them. I promise." And for just an instant, Mary's face softened. And Jonathan roared. It wasn't a sound heard through ears, but through bone and marrow. A guttural vibration that shook the gallery walls. The glass of the display case cracked, a jagged line splitting across its surface. Guests screamed as the daguerreotype rattled violently, its silver plate glowing hotter and hotter. Marcus grabbed Sarah's arm. "We need to get out." But Sarah shook her head. "If we leave now, the story dies with them." "He wins again." The director, pale and trembling, shouted orders no one heard. Security scrambled to control the chaos, but the crowd surged toward the exits, trampling displays, shattering glass cases. And still, the daguerreotype glowed. Sarah forced her way to the front, standing just inches from the case. Jonathan's figure loomed larger than ever, his mouth twisted in rage. Behind him, the children cowered, their faces pressed against the invisible barrier. With a trembling voice, Sarah cried out, "You're seeing now. The world knows. You can't hide anymore." The silver script shifted, new words burning into the plate. Not enough. The temperature in the gallery plummeted. Frost crawled across the case, spreading in jagged patterns. Guests' breath fogged in the air as the roar of Jonathan's presence grew louder, shaking dust from the rafters. Sarah realized with a jolt of terror what he meant. It wasn't enough to expose him. Jonathan Beckford wanted to silence the truth. Again. And this time he had no limits. The daguerreotype's glass shattered with a deafening crack. Shards exploded outward, scattering across the gallery floor. The silver plate within glowed white-hot, humming with violent energy. Sarah shielded her face as Marcus dragged her back. Sparks rained down, alarms wailed, and sprinklers burst to life, dousing the gallery in freezing water. Through the spray, Sarah glimpsed one final image burned into the plate. The three children, no longer pleading, no longer screaming, standing tall, hand in hand, facing their father's shadow. Then the glow collapsed inward, and the gallery went dark. When the emergency lights flickered on, the daguerreotype lay in ruins, its once solid surface warped and blackened. The crowd had scattered. Sirens wailed outside as fire crews stormed the building. Sarah stood dripping, her heart pounding, staring at the ruined plate. She knew this wasn't over. The Beckford children had shown themselves, and their father had fought back. But the war between truth and silence had only just begun. That night, as Sarah replayed the chaos in her mind, she noticed something chilling. In every photo taken by guests before the disaster, the daguerreotype appeared normal three children. Nothing more. Only those who had been there had witnessed the transformation. Only those in the gallery had seen Jonathan Beckford reveal himself. It was as though the spirits had chosen their witnesses carefully, and Sarah knew she was one of them. The museum stood silent the morning after the disaster. Broken glass still littered the gallery floor, and the Beckford exhibition, once hailed as a triumph, was now cordoned off with yellow tape. Reporters swarmed outside, speculating about technical malfunctions and electrical fires. But Sarah knew better. Jonathan Beckford had made himself known, and he wasn't finished. Sarah sat alone in her apartment, staring at the ruined daguerreotype recovered from the gallery. Its surface was warped, blackened by unnatural heat, but faint shapes remained. She could still see outlines of the children, their figures blurred but defiant. In the silence of the room, she whispered, "I saw you. The world saw you. Isn't that enough?" The air grew cold. A faint scratching came from her desk. Slowly, letters carved themselves into the wood grain, invisible hands pressing deep into the surface. Not yet. Sarah's heart pounded. The children still had more to say. She returned to the museum archives, digging deeper into the Beckford records than ever before. Hours passed in a blur of brittle pages, ink-stained diaries, and forgotten ledgers. Then, tucked inside an unmarked folder, she found it a sealed letter dated November 1857. Her hands trembled as she opened it. The handwriting was Catherine Beckford's. "To whoever finds this, I cannot bear the weight of silence. My husband murdered our daughter Mary in a fit of rage. William and Catherine, my surviving children, saw it with their own eyes, fearing for their lives. Harold and I concealed Mary's body. Days later, my children rose against their father. His fall from the stairs was no accident. It was justice. But we buried the truth for fear of ruin, and I have lived with that sin in silence. If you read this, know the Beckford name must no longer be honored. Let the truth be known. Catherine Beckford." Sarah's breath caught. This was it, the final piece. Catherine herself had confessed. The children's pleas were not just about Mary's murder. They wanted the world to know the full truth that their act of defiance had ended their father's reign of terror. That night, Sarah sat at her desk, the ruined daguerreotype and Catherine's letter before her. The air around her was heavy, charged. She felt them, the children, waiting. She whispered, "I'll publish it all. The confession, the letter, everything. The world will know." The room chilled further. The ruined plate shimmered faintly, silver lines crawling across its surface. For a moment, the image reformed. The three Beckford children stood together, their faces calm, no longer twisted by fear. Mary smiled faintly, but then the air thickened, oppressive. Shadows pooled in the corners of the room, stretching upward like claws. Jonathan Beckfords. Presence surged heavier than ever before. A guttural voice rumbled from the darkness. Liar, you cannot erase me. Sarah's hands shook, but she held the letter aloft. You're already erased. This is the truth. This is your legacy. The shadows surged, the voice roaring with fury. Her lights flickered violently. Books toppled from shelves. For a terrifying moment, she thought he would burst into her world entirely. But then the children appeared, not in flesh, not in shadow, but as soft, radiant figures of light. 3 small silhouettes, hands linked, stepping between Sarah and the darkness. Mary's voice whispered in Sarah's ear, clear and strong. He can't hurt us anymore. The shadows recoiled, hissing, their edges fraying into smoke. Jonathan roared once more, but his voice faltered, breaking apart as the children's light spread wider. Then, with a final crash of sound, he was gone. The air stilled. The silence was complete. Sarah sat trembling, tears streaking her face. The children were still there, faint outlines glowing in the dim light. Mary stepped forward, her form barely more than mist, yet her eyes shone. Thank you, she whispered. Again, and just like that, they were gone. The room warmed. The scratching, the handprints, the whispers, they never returned. Weeks later, Sarah published her findings. The letter, the locket, Harold's confession, and the archaeological discovery were combined into a single comprehensive report. Headlines spread across the country. Beckford legacy exposed. Gold rush tycoon a murderer. Secrets of a 19th century family finally revealed. The public was stunned. The Beckfords, once remembered as pillars of prosperity, were recast as a family destroyed by violence and buried truths. For the first time, Mary Beckford's name was written in history, not as a ghost, but as a child who had lived, suffered, and been silenced. Sarah attended the exhibition one last time, now redesigned to reflect the truth. Jonathan's portrait was gone. In its place, a memorial plaque bore the names of Catherine, William, and Mary Beckford. Visitors no longer laughed at ghost stories. They stood in reverent silence, reading the confessions, looking at the locket, and acknowledging the suffering of children whose voices had been buried for 160 years. As Sarah walked through the gallery, she felt no cold chill, no oppressive air, only peace. Outside, she glanced up at the setting sun, its light bathing the museum in gold. For the first time, she felt that the Beckford children had finally stepped free from their father's shadow. She whispered to the evening air, "Rest." Now, and in the quiet that followed, she could almost hear laughter light, free and carried away on the wind. The mystery of the 1857 family photograph was no longer just a chilling curiosity. It was a testimony, a voice carved into silver and stone, demanding the truth. And because one woman had listened, that truth would never be buried again. The children were remembered. The father was condemned. And history, at last, was made whole.